everyone. I'm very happy to welcome Rob DeRosa today. Rob is an enterprise customer success engineer here at Xamarin. Today, Rob's going to help us take our Xamarin.Forms apps to the next level. He'll be showing us some tips and tricks related to performance and adding some polish to those out-of-the-box apps.
Great, thank you, Rob. Pleasure to be speaking with everybody today. I'm going to go through some of the lessons I learned and some of the tips that I gained while I was building an application using Xamarin.Forms while at Xamarin. And so this is me. As Rob mentioned, I work with our enterprise customers out of the San Francisco office up in the Bay Area. And my job, essentially, I've been a developer by trade for the last decade and a half. My job really is to work with our enterprise customers to help them build the best apps they can possibly build using the technology that Xamarin has. And that goes into Insights. It also is Test Cloud, as well as Platform. And so I want to talk today about an app that I had been working on for about 3 or 4 months called Xamarin Sport. This is an app that is going to be sort of the context for the different tips and tricks today. So I kind of want to give you an overview of what Sport is all about. This is an app that is used to facilitate leaderboard and sort of manage rankings within different leagues. So the general sort of story behind Sport was the San Francisco office is one of the bigger offices that Xamarin has. And we have a basement down there recently. We just moved into a new building about a year ago. And we have a basement, and there's a few ping pong tables down there now and some darts and some foosball and things like that. And it turns out several employees that I work with, colleagues of mine, are a bit competitive, and we decided it'd be really fun to have sort of a leaderboard that would help rank different skill sets and different players. And you could have different leagues, so there'd be a dart league and maybe a foosball league and a ping pong league. And so instead of, in lieu of creating a physical sort of, real ladder board or leaderboard, we thought it'd be a really cool idea to build this as an application. And we thought Forms would be a perfect fit for it because it's internal and it's not a really super complex app. There's not a ton of really complicated UI that I foresaw when building this application. So there's 2 flavors of it. There's iOS and Android clients for it. The application is mostly Xaml. I don't really do any C# UI construction unless I have to, sort of building it on the fly. So Xaml is really heavily used, and bindings are also very, very heavily used. So wherever I can use bindings and take advantage of bindings, I do. As Rob mentioned, I have several years in WPF, and I really, really love WPF. I fell in love with the markup syntax, the separation of user interface and logic. And so when Forms announced that Xaml was a big part of Forms, I immediately sort of fell in love with that again. So you'll see me take a lot of what I learned in my WPF years, and you'll see that spill over into Sport. I tried not to use too many custom renders. I really wanted to focus the code in the shared section. So there's some avenues I took in lieu of custom renderers, and I'm going to go over those, and we'll talk sort of why I did that. But I also used quite a bit of plugins. So if you haven't ever used a plugin, they're available on NuGet, and they're not specific to Forms. You can use them without Forms, but I use I think 2 or 3 here for connectivity and some saving some settings and things like that. But plugins are great. And then I use some animations, and we'll talk about how you can use animations to add some polish to your application. I also make good usage of Messaging Center and the dependency service. It's pretty difficult to build a Forms application without using the dependency service, so it's definitely using it there. And then I have UI test that is written for both clients, for iOS and Android, using the same code base. So there's maybe 1 or 2 conditionals that if it's Android, do this, if it's iOS, do this, but 90% of the code for the UI test is completely shared. And then the whole backend is powered by an Azure Mobile Service C# backend. I probably spend half my time building just the backend. It's been a while since I've done Web API and Entity Framework and things like that. So the front end went pretty quickly. It was the back end, there were some things to figure out. And we'll kind of go into that a little bit later. So there's an application design goals that I had in mind for Sport when I built it. There's simplified registration and authentication. So you'll see that when I launch the application, you have to log in with a Google account using OAuth. It's just the simplest way. I didn't want to create a new Active Directory system. I didn't want to create my own registration system. And at Xamarin, we use Google OAuth for everything, so it made sense. I wanted the athletes, you become an athlete when you join, even though we're playing ping pong. You're an athlete and you can join multiple leagues, so I wanted that to be an option. You can view the current rank of any player within any ladder or any league. And then athletes will be able to see their previous stats and their challenge history. So you should be able to see sort of, the previous games that you've played and who won and who lost. And then finally, the application needs to facilitate the challenge flow and what happens when the challenge ends. So if the rule of thumb is that you can challenge one spot ahead of you in the league as long as that player doesn't have an existing challenge in play. And so the application will facilitate sending the challenge to the challengee, and that challengee accepts the challenge, notifies the challenger, and then you play your game, and then you post the results. And then the back end will do the logic to determine who the winner is, and then re-rank the board. And this application actually sends out push notifications for a lot of different things. So when you join a league, there's a push notification that goes out to tell the other members of the league that you joined. When a challenge is completed and there's a winner, it sends a notification to everybody in the league letting you know who won. We have an internal server for Xamarin's employees where everything's enabled. I released this application into the iOS and App Stores so that Xamarin clients could access the application without having to pull down the code, build it, and deploy it. So you can access these in the App Stores right now without having to bring any code down at all. But that is pointing to a public-facing Azure instance that doesn't have push notifications enabled. So just a warning, if you go and download the apps off the App Store, or if you pull down the source code from Git, it's going to point to a public-facing Azure mobile instance service that doesn't have notifications enabled. I just didn't want random people being notified all day, by strangers. So just know that the notifications aren't enabled. But the source code does contain full source code for cross-platform templated push notifications. So if you've ever been using Azure Mobile Service Backend and you've been curious how to get templated notifications working, I have source code for that you can use for that. So Sport shares about 93% of the code. I had a pretty big focus on sharing as much code as I could. So there's not a whole lot of platform-specific code for iOS or Android. Most of the code that's platform-specific deals with either styling that couldn't be done in Xaml styles, like UI appearance in iOS, or push notification stuff. So registering for push notifications or handling incoming payloads, that's not shareable code at this point, but everything else pretty much is. So one thing I wanted to do real quick was kind of just show you what Sport is. This is the GitHub repo. You can access this by going to github.com/Xamarin/Sport. I'm going to put this in the chat window so that everybody can access it. This will give you an idea of kind of some other elements that the application goes into. But one thing I wanted to do real quick to give everybody an overview of how the application operates and looks is to show you this quick YouTube video of it running. And I'll paste this in here because I know that maybe over the webinar it might not play properly. But if we look at this, this is an iOS and an Android device next to each other. You'll see push notifications enabled here. And what this will do is it will one player will challenge the other player. So the iOS is one athlete, the Android is the other athlete. They'll sort of challenge each other, and this will give you an idea of what the flow is. So I have a question. Does Xamarin support Windows right now? Currently, there's not a Windows client. I have actually a customer of mine is looking to submit a pull request for the Windows client. The only reason I didn't do Windows just yet is because I haven't spent time to curate the assets or resources for Windows. There's nothing that prohibits this from working on Windows that I can foresee. It's just I haven't put the time in to make the resources available for Windows just yet. So we pull the refresh. So you'll see a little bit of a parallax feature right here. We're going to talk about how to implement that parallax feature that works in both iOS and Android. And you'll see that both players are in the same league, table tennis, but they're different colors. One thing I wanted to mention is that this app was designed at runtime to choose a randomly selected color. So the leagues will change colors. There's only about 5 or 6 different colors to choose from, but it will choose one at runtime at random, just to kind of mix things up and give it a little bit more of some spice. So we have one player has challenged the other player, and we're just waiting for the player on the left to accept or decline the challenge. And you can nudge the athlete to make a decision here. So the person on the left will accept. And then once they've accepted, they'll play the match. One of the players will input the score. And there's some logic to make sure that they don't post double scores. But once there's a winner, you'll see that it will move on to the next page where it will display the results of that challenge. And then once they move back to the leaderboard, you'll notice that the ranks are now swapped out. So they change places because 6th player beat the 5th player. So that's a quick overview. There's a few other small features in here, but for all intents and purposes, that's the application. As I mentioned, you can download the source code today and start building this and running it. But that's kind of what we're going to be basing today's tips and tricks on is this app. So the first tip that I wanted to, two things I wanted to mention before we get in here, just to kind of set the stage. There are 2 or 3 design patterns that I wanted to mention in this application before we get started. The first one is that all my content pages derive from a base content page. Every base content page has to have a view model. All my view models derive from a base view model. So I have a 1-to-1 correlation between a view model and a content page. Every content page has to have at least one view model. And that view model serves to be the binding context. You can have more than one view model if you want to, but you need to have at least one. This is just something that I decided as a pattern that I was going to follow. So every page has at least one view model. And then there's also some things that happen with tasks that I'll talk about in a little bit that's different from, I think, the typical way that you would run tasks. So the first tip that I wanted to talk about as far as polish is concerned is animations. Animations are something that has been around in Forms for a while. This is not something that's new to Xamarin 2 or Forms Release 2, but I feel like it's one of the most underutilized features of Forms, and they're really easy to use. Forms supports basic animations, so nothing super complex, but even with these 4 animations, you can do some pretty cool things. So I'm going to play this animation on the left here of the registration process, or the wizard of what you see the very first time you use Sport. So you'll see these elements scale out and then fade away and then drop in and then slide away, things like that. So that animation technique was pretty easy to write. So there's the 4 basic animations that are supported are scaling. Scaling controls size, translate, and that controls position, so you're moving X and Y coordinates. Fade, which controls your alpha and opacity, and then of course rotation. In addition to those 4 types of animations, there is, you can specify sort of the curve or the easing of the type of animation, so bounce, cubic, linear, or sine. And then you can combine animations. You don't have to always await your animations. So if you wanted to kick off 2 animations on the same element, let's say you wanted to rotate it and fade it, or you wanted to translate it, so move it away and fade it, you can do those at the same time by not awaiting the first animation. So it's pretty simple. Just don't await the first one, execute the second one, and then await the second one. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that, Forms isn't doing its own custom animation, moving things with coordinates. It actually uses the underlying OS animation libraries. So you're going to be using, for iOS, it'd be core animation. So no custom animation framework that Forms is imposing on top of Forms. So this would be the code that would be used to do some of those animations that I just talked about. In this case, these are those two buttons at the bottom right here on the purple screen that fade out or translate away to the right. So right here, you'll see when we hit OK or continue, these guys will fade and rotate to the right, or translate to the right. And all we're doing is fading it, and we're not awaiting this fade, and then we're doing a layout. So we're changing opacity and then translating this to move to the right side of the screen. And we can do those combined by just not awaiting the first one. And you can overlap them too by awaiting a fraction of the next animation speed. So easy to overlap, easy to combine. The next kind of cool little polished thing that you can add if you have a page that has sort of a hero image. These are considered hero images, I guess, or main images. If you have one of those and then you have some content underneath, and it's within a scroll view, and a lot of times they are within scroll views. I almost always have my pages within scroll views just because of the nature of the different screen sizes within Android devices specifically. So just to be safe, you pretty much put it in a scroll view so that there's not enough horizontal space or vertical space you can scroll. Having said that, if you do have a hero image, one of the cool things you can do to get this parallax effect is with just a few lines of code, you can sort of fake it what iOS would normally give you. And the way that you do that is this image up here, we translate its y coordinate a fraction of the scroller's y position. So what we'll do is we'll say that we'll take the scroll y and we might multiply that by a fourth or 0.4 of the actual length. And then we'll translate that photo image's y coordinate, that fraction. And that's all we do. And then for the iOS side of things, when you reach that 0 coordinate and you pull below that, because lists or UI table views in iOS allow you to pull below the 0 coordinate, then we just scale it out and we center it. And that gives it that effect of it sort of expanding left and right. For Android, just so you know, they don't allow you to pull the list views below the 0 coordinate, so you won't get that scaling effect. But that's just kind of the way that Android works. But this is a really kind of cool little trick with very little code, and it works really, really well. And one thing I just wanted to mention is if you try to demo this on a simulator, you're going to get a bad stuttery effect. I wouldn't test it on the simulator. I'd really do this on the device. It's just odd on a simulator, but on a device it looks really, really clean and polished. So that parallax effect is something that you can implement very, very simply, and it kind of makes your application pop. So this might not be seem new to anybody, or this might seem kind of programming 101, but I found that not a lot of developers are taking advantage of reusable controls within Forms. So when I talk about a reusable control, this would be equivalent to sort of a WPF or ASP.NET user control. And anytime you use, my rule of thumb is if I use something more than twice, I'm going to put it into a control. I don't like having to duplicate code throughout my application. I know maintenance is going to be kind of a nightmare down the road. So I don't really want to copy and paste code everywhere. So I'll create a reusable control. And all you have to do is create a content view and derive from content view and then start adding your code into Xaml. You always, if you're going to be using a control or you're going to make this control easy to consume, I recommend using bindable properties if you can. And I'll talk about that in a second. We'll take a look at some code real quick on how to do this. So I've got this control right here called the challenge card view. That's the control that we saw right here. This is the challenge card control view. And what we'll do is, in the code behind, we're going to derive from content view. I've added a gesture here just because I want this to be tappable. and it's not a giant button. But the one thing that I've done here is I've created a bindable property that allows me to specify sort of the view model or the context. The challenge view card is used to display the current state of a challenge between two players. So I know that the data that I need for that, displaying that data and the state, is always going to be, well, should always be within a challenge view model. So I know that that's the right object for me to use. If you haven't heard of bindable properties or you've never used them, they come from the WPF world. And what they are, they're sort of like properties on steroids. They allow you to bind a value when using this control without having to specify the code behind. So it makes these properties bindable, if you will, for lack of a better term. And so these are really, really good to use. There's two sort of sections to creating a bindable property. You have to create the static read-only property portion, and then you will create sort of an encapsulated property wrapper around that. So really, really useful if you're going to be creating reusable controls here. The other thing that I found out that's kind of interesting one more template control that or custom control is this image button. The image button is used everywhere in the application. So right here, I'm just going to come in here, log in. So that image button is used, let's see here. Oh, I think I have to have an existing challenge. Here we go. So here's two image buttons. I've got an accept and a decline. I've got a thumbs up and a thumbs down. And I created a custom control for this. I know that the button control within Forms supports images, but you have no control over layout. You have no control over alignment or margins or padding or where the image sits. So I wanted much, much more control over that. I didn't use a custom renderer here. I chose to create a new control called image button. And this was part of my focus on keeping the code shared. So it'd be up to you. You could create this as a custom render if you wanted to. I just chose to layer up some different Xamarin elements here to create the look and feel that I wanted. And so what I've done here is I've created an absolute layout of my roots, and then I put a button behind it to serve as the background. This is just for the background button color and sort of the background of the button. And then on top of that, I lay a stack layout that's oriented horizontally, and I add my image and my label where I can control spacing, padding, margins, all that kind of stuff, very, very granular level. And then on top of that, I lay a transparent button to handle the click events. Because if the user clicked directly on the image or the text, that hit event wouldn't be passed through.
So Rob, there's a couple questions in here before we go on.
Sure.
See if we could knock some of those out.
Absolutely.
Yuri has a question. Are there other gestures besides touch in Xamarin.Forms?
We just added one in Xamarin 2 called Pan. I think Pan Zoom. So there are some other ones, and they're adding them with sort of every new release. Not the pre-releases or the incremental releases, but they do seem to be adding more and more gestures. I think there was a new one added in the latest release, Pan Zoom. Yeah.
Great. Second, okay, yeah. So you zoomed in. If we can zoom in on the font, make sure everyone can read it. Esteban says, how did you get the cards styling for the app?
Oh, okay. Let me go back to that real quick. I'll finish up with this image button, and then we'll jump to the card view. But this is an image button control that I use heavily throughout the application. There's a few bindable properties here. You can see command, background color, text, and image source. And then finally, I had a little animation that I do when you click on the button to scale it up and then scale it back down to size. That, again, adds a little bit of polish to your application. You don't want to do a lot of crazy animations on buttons, but a little something gives a little nice spice to it. But yeah, let's take a look at that card view again. So if we look at the card view right here, we can see that we've got an icon up here, challenge title, date, profile image and text, and then two buttons. basically, there's states for each of those. Right now, the challenge is in a accept or decline state. So that code is going to be, I believe, right here. And what we'll do is we'll show different buttons based on the different state. So these are the buttons that you're seeing. And I've got my image button, right, to show accept and then to show decline. So that's kind of how the buttons are displayed. The styling is not too crazy. We've basically got a title bar, and then we've got this gray line that sort of serves as a really cheesy shadow behind it. And that's done by setting the background color of my card view, and then I have a white background color of my stack layout that's directly inside of my my content view. And then I give it a sort of a margin or whatever of 0.5, 0.5 to give it that that line on the side here. And the rest of the stuff is just putting, the image, which is that fencing, that little guy fencing, or the challenge icon right here, and then the text and then the date, the proposed time. So feel free to download this code. Again, it's on GitHub. You can check out how I styled this. But really, I'm just using some stack layouts, some absolute layouts, controlling padding carefully. That's pretty much it. I do want to mention one thing about absolute layout. If you haven't used absolute layout, it's one of the best controls to use, one of the best layout controls to use. And it's really kind of a difficult control to understand because I haven't found a lot of really good explanations on how absolute layout works. But I did want to show you guys real quickly, since we're on the topic, about absolute layout. Absolute layout is used to control size and position of child elements that are relative to the parent absolute layout. So absolute layout has two properties: layout bounds and layout flags. The value of layout bounds is based on the value of layout flags. So depending on what you set layout flags to, the layout bounds value will be applicable to that. There's three values typically that you'll see: size proportional, position proportional, or all, or both. Size proportional means I want to size this child element proportional to the size of my absolute layout parent. Position proportional is the same thing, except it's doing position proportional. So when layout bounds proportional the X and Y anchor points will be interpolated as the element changes position. That is one of the sort of the strangest things about absolute layout. I think it's best sort of described with a video. So I'm going to show you guys real quickly how this sort of works with absolute layout. So I created this application right here, and I recorded it being animated. We've got this green box in the top left-hand corner. Its anchor point is this white line. And right now, because the green box is sitting on the left-hand side of the screen, the anchor point is going to be on the left-hand side. As this green box moves to the right side of the parent absolute layout, and the parent absolute layout is the entire window here, minus the buttons at the bottom. As we move it to the right-hand side, that anchor point will be interpolated, and it will shift as well. So if I hit play here, you'll see that anchor point move. So right now I'm going to pause it. Right now we're in the middle. Our X is 0.5, our Y is 0, our width is 0.25, and our height is 0.25. That means it's a quarter of the size of the parent and a quarter of the width of the parent. And notice that the interpolation point is directly in the center of the child element now. And as we continue to translate this to the right side of the screen, or position this to the right side, now the anchor point is completely on the right-hand side of the element. And you'll see that X is whole number 1 now, instead of 0 or 0.5. Same thing with sizing. As we size the element and we expand it to fill the absolute layout parent, the anchor point will interpolate as well. So absolute layout is really, really, really great. The reason why it's so great is because you can position and size elements based on the parent's screen size. and that is something we do all the time. So I just wanted to mention, absolutely, it's not really a tip or a trick. I just felt it's something that's really, really underutilized within Forms. So one of the things I wanted to mention really quickly is Forms obviously doesn't allow you to style your controls, to the nth degree. There are limitations that the engineers chose to make. So there's certain controls you can't really style very well. And date picker and time picker are one of those controls. In this application, we use date time picker to choose a challenge date and time. And right here, you'll see I've got a date and time picker that when you click on this Friday, December 29th, it actually shows the date picker. If you've never used the date picker or the time picker, they show up as text boxes, unstyled default text boxes with fonts and text in there that you can't control. You can't control the border style of the text box. There's almost no styling that you can apply to a date or time picker currently. So what I did is, with a little bit of trickery, you can kind of hide certain things. So what I wanted to do was not show that date time picker. I wanted to allow the user to choose the date and time, but I didn't want them to see that ugly UI. So what I did is I created the UI that you see on this guy right here. And the way that we do that is I have a label that's red, and I can style the label any way I want, because label, there's like no limitations on what you can do with label. So I've got a date label and a time label. On top of that time label and date label, I have a date picker and a time picker with its opacity set to like 0.1, like it's almost, or 0.01, it's almost completely invisible. And the user doesn't see that, but they'll tap on what they think is the label. They're really tapping into the date picker, which throws up the time picker from the bottom or the date picker from the bottom. And then I bound my label value, the date value, to the value of my view model. So right here, I've got, wrong page, okay. So right here, I've got a label, and its text is bound to selected date time in my view model. On top of that, I've got a date picker whose opacity is 0.02. And its date is bound to the selected date of my view model. So as I flick this time picker or the date picker and it lands on some value, my label automatically updates because of the bindings between my date picker, my view model, and my label. So between bindings and opacity, you can sort of move beyond the limitations that some of these styling limitations provide. So a quick little cheesy trick that you can do to get beyond some limitations. Any questions before I move on to the performance? We're going to move on to the list view performance.
Yeah, there's a few in here. So a question, which I think you might answer, did you use any custom renderers for Android and iOS?
Yeah, great question. So I did use about 1.5 for iOS and 1 for Android. And I know it sounds weird to say I used 1.5, but as I mentioned, the leagues change as I navigate in. The colors of the leagues change. So as I move into the foosball, you're going to see a dark blue. This coin flip league is more of a red color. When I navigate back and I go back to the main list of leagues, you'll see that the navigation bar changes from red to gray. And in order to make that change happen before I navigate versus after the navigation completes, I had to implement a custom navigation render for iOS. So if we look at iOS, you'll see providers, theme navigation render. A little bit of coding here. The only reason this navigation, as the comments mention, is necessary is because I wanted to change the theming of the navigation bar before I navigated instead of after. Navigation within Forms only gives you an on-navigated event, not an on-navigating event. And so I had to do some custom things here to kind of, using reflection to kind of get the effect that I wanted. This isn't necessary in Android. And one of the cool things is that I realized is that you can implement custom renders in only one platform, and it'll pick it up in that one platform and ignore it in the other one. So this doesn't exist in Android. This is the half render, if you will. The other render that I used was for the entry field. I wanted some additional controls over my entry field, so things like background color, font family, border, max length. being able to specify the max length of a text field was important to me. So I have an entry field that facilitates these additional properties for both iOS and Android. Outside of that, there's no custom renderers for controls. I do have a few providers that go into the UI area. Those would be the HUD provider and the Toast provider or Toast notifier. So I use HUD for heads of display for certain messages or loading things, and then I also use Toast for displaying incoming push notification payloads and other quick notifications. But I use the dependency service and interfaces for these HUD and Toast. So that's about as much platform-specific code as I'll really use. There's not much outside of that.
Great.
But yeah, great question.
So I think you might get to this later on, but if you do, that's fine. Have you tested this with Xamarin Test Cloud? And if so, how do you test the login with Google? Because they don't have test user accounts like Facebook.
So great question. I do test with the Test Cloud. Down here, you'll see another project called sport.ui test, and here's our test code. We have one set of tests for both platforms, and it's mostly the same logic. There's only a few of these conditional statements where I have to do one thing versus the other when you get the toolbars and stuff. The way that the login stuff works is there's a keys.cs file right here. This has your username and password in it. So you'll see that we use that right here and right here. What I would say is just create a normal Gmail account. Create a test user account and log in with that. It doesn't have to be any specific user. You can change these tests up. This test just goes in, goes through pretty much all the pages. It doesn't actually send off a challenge. It gets to the point where it's choosing a date to send off a challenge, but doesn't actually facilitate that flow because the challenging and accepting the challenges is a two-user interaction, and that's not really doable with Test Cloud just yet. So I sort of test as much as I can with UI tests that doesn't involve a response from another athlete, if that makes sense. But you can use any just use any Gmail account should work. Anybody can log into the app, so it's not like there's specific domains or anything like that have to be adhered to.
Okay. Are you using behaviors and triggers to manage animations instead of filling your code behind?
I'm not, but you could. That's another option. I overlap and combine my animations, and so I have to await certain things, but then not await other animations. So I think that's the reason why I decided not to use behaviors or triggers. But certainly, the more code you can keep in markup, I think is the better. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Two questions here, both related to the opacity. If the date picker has a 0.2 opacity, how did you pick the date? What did I miss? And another one, would a 0.00 opacity make it such that the control isn't drawn and can't be clicked?
Yeah, that was actually what I saw. A 0 opacity for some reason, or even 0.01 wouldn't draw the control. So .02 was that sweet spot where it wasn't viewable, but it was also being rendered. The way that you selected date is just because it's invisible and you can't see it. When you click into it and you tap into it, it pops up the date picker control at the bottom. I'm trying to find something. Okay, I can challenge somebody here. So I click challenge, right? So here's the thing. I click this guy, and up pops my date picker, and I can spin the month thing, and as it lands on May, the label will update. And again, the date picker value is bound to my view model, and the label is bound to my view model. So let's take a look at my view model for that challenge date. I've got the selected date property, selected time, and then selected date and time. And so those two controls, the controls are the label's bound to this, or the different pickers are bound to these different properties, and the label will update as those properties are updated because set property change tells the label to update. I hope that kind of explains it. You're kind of just that text box is sitting on top of that label, but it's not visible, but it's still actionable, I guess is the best way to put it.
Neat.
Cool.
So Mark says, did you create any custom pickers for selecting other values from a list? Any custom pickers?
I didn't. I just used just the date and time picker, just kind of use what was out of the box.
Okay, and let's see, one more. Since Xamarin does not support a XAML designer, did it act as a hindrance when you're designing the content page?
I mean, having a designer or a visualizer is always going to make things go more quickly. It wasn't a hindrance, I would say. You know, you make some tweaks, you rebuild, and you see how that equates. What I'd recommend is focusing on one platform instead of having to go between the two each time. Knock one out and then tweak the other one to make sure that it looks good on the other one. We will be coming out at some point with some sort of visualizer that allows you to see your code in real time, similar to what Sketches has right now. So that, while editing continue would be great to have right now, or blend type of visualization as you're editing live, I think we'll be having something coming down the line that will help facilitate that. But it wasn't too bad. It wasn't like it was enough to just deter me from continuing to move forward. I try to make a lot of changes at once, see how that reflects, and then come back and make some more changes.
All right, and Chase mentions zero opacity seems to work on Android. He's used a style with the on-platform for that ability, so you could change it for iOS and Android.
Yeah,
Android
yeah, you could.
For zero.
Sure. Yeah, you could certainly do it on-platform. I didn't see anything. I wasn't seeing any artifacts in the iOS side or the Android side, so I just kind of left it as it is. But sure, you could certainly do that. Awesome. So I did want to move on to performance, and performance is mostly going to be around list view. We had some changes made to Forms 2.0 that I wanted to mention. The first thing is headers and footers. If you're going to add additional UI into your list view, either at the top or the bottom, in a lot of cases it's the bottom where you want to have additional buttons or other maybe filtering controls, things like that. Don't add your list view to a scroll view as like a stack layout at the bottom. There are header and footer templates you can implement. There's actually like a footer template and a header template, just and it's a view cell. You can do whatever you want in there. You can add whatever you want. Never put a list view in a scroll view. That's oil and water. So the performance will be awful. It'll get confused. So make use of headers and footers. They're really, really useful if you have to add UI at the beginning and at the bottom of your list views. We talked about absolute layouts. Absolute layouts are really good to use in cell templates. So when you can use them, if it makes sense, it's applicable to your UI, use absolute layouts in lieu of stack layouts, in lieu of grids. Grids are kind of expensive. So absolute layouts are your friend. And I guarantee you, once you understand absolute layouts and you get to using them, they're your best friends. They're really, really great. One of the few tips that I hadn't really known about recently was eager loading and applying binding context to pages before they're loaded. So this is really helpful with pages that contain list views, but it can be applicable to any type of page. So if you're on a page, let's say there's a page with 1 or 2 buttons, and it's a page that you know your users are probably going to navigate to, you can eager load those early on. So as your page loads, there's a button down, you know, maybe you have to scroll down to get to it. Once they click on that, it's going to load page 2. You can preload page 2 on a separate thread. I know that kind of sounds weird. When I first heard it, I was like, hey, loading UI on a separate thread, how's that even possible? But you can do it because it's the forms logic. It's not the actual UI rendering of the underlying operating system. And so new up and initialize your new pages. Apply your binding context to those pages on that same background thread, and then you're good to go. And a lot of the heavy lifting is done for you. By the time you actually click to view page 2, it's already loaded. So one quick thing I wanted to mention is do not apply your binding context after the page has been added to the visual tree or you push it onto the navigation stack. Always do it beforehand. You're causing unnecessary layout passes, and it'll slow your application down. Finally, use a recycle element. This is a new enum value for a caching strategy mechanism within list views. So let's talk about what recycle element does and what the options are. So Forms 2.0 introduced retain element and recycle element as possible values for list view caching strategies. Retain element is the default. It's what is used today, and it's what it would be used if you didn't specify anything. It creates one form cell instance for each row in the bound data set. This is a form cell instance, not an actual UI table view cell it's the forms representation of that row instance. But forms is going to create one for if you have 20,000 rows in your record set. It's going to create 20,000 forms instances. Recycle element falls more in line with the typical recycling of the UI cells. It's not default, and it creates one form cell instance for each visual element that's visible on the screen. Recycle element is your best bet for most scenarios. So across the board, recycle element is probably going to be what you want to be using moving forward. But retain element can have better performance in certain cases. Those cases would be lists with fewer cells, 300 records or less, I would say. Cell templates that contain a lot of bindings. If you have a very complex cell or it's a big row, displays a lot of data, you have 25, 30 bindings, you may want to use retain element there. And then swapping out root elements based on the binding context. This is common if you want to show and hide different things in a cell at the root level based on a flag or type of your binding context. I've done this before, but if you're really using this heavily, then you may want to keep retain element as part of your caching strategy. But outside of that, pretty much recycle element is going to be your best bet. So the one odd thing about caching strategy is that it's not a property. It's really a constructor argument that is passed in once and set and never changed. So because it can only be set once, there's a huge performance penalty that's changed, and you really can't change it. So the way you set it is a little bit strange. You'll set it just like a regular property in Xaml if you're consuming a regular instance of ListView. There's actually 3 ways that you can specify caching strategy in ListView depending on how you're using it. So typical ListView, I'm using a regular ListView, it's the normal one out of the box. Boom, I can specify it using caching strategy, recycle element in my Xaml. I know that looks like a property. The Xaml compiler, the Xaml C compiler, or the interpreter at runtime will look for this special property, do some magic, and instantiate your ListView with that value in the constructor, as if you had built it in code behind. So I know it looks like a property, but it's not. Subclass ListView, and you want to create your own. I do this all the time. So I've created a custom ListView. You have to specify the default strategy in your constructor or passing into the base constructor. So if you want to set like recycle as your default, you have to specify that here. That'll be your default from any instances of this custom ListView used from that point forward. Note that even if I'm creating a custom ListView and I specify my ListView element or my UI in XAML, I cannot specify the caching strategy in XAML. You'll get a compiler error. So if you're subclassing ListView, you've got to do it in the constructor in code behind. Now, if you're going to use an instance of that subclass ListView, so I'm using an instance of custom ListView right here, and I want to deviate away from the base ListView that's specified here, or I want to override it, or I just want to change it for this one instance, you can't specify it like a normal ListView up here. You have to use X argument to specify the value. So I just wanted to point that out. These 2 will cause compiler errors if you try to specify this in XAML like the first one. And I kind of scratched my head when I first hit this issue. So I wanted to point that out. It's kind of a little confusing. The docs do a really good job of explaining this, but it is kind of important to know the different ways that you would set caching strategy. And then finally, I think I already went over that one. The XAML compiler. So the XAML compiler, or XAML C, is something that was released in Xamarin 2, sorry, Forms 2. And it is an effort to speed up the inflation time of your UI. So currently, the way that that your application runs by default is not XAML compiled, right? Your XAML is interpreted at runtime, and the issue there is it's a little bit slower. It has to inflate a lot of views repeatedly, and in certain cases, if you have a binding error or you have, not a binding error, but if you have a XAML error markup syntax error, you're not going to find out about that until you've deployed and you're running in runtime and your application crashes. So Compiler is great because it catches your XAML errors at runtime instead of at compile time instead of runtime. It's going to reduce the amount of resources you have because those XAML files are no longer needed. They're compiled. So those XAML, there's no interpretation at runtime. And Jason, the lead engineer of Forms, gave me some metrics here. He said on average about 10 times faster to inflate the views by using the XAML compiler. Unfortunately, there's no benefit to reflection. There's no impact on reflection because can't reflect things at compile time. Just can't do it. But the big impact, especially if you're going to be using retain elements, right? You don't want to use recycle element. If you're going to be using retain element, then you really want to be using XAML-C. There's a huge benefit there. And then finally, you have to manually enable XAML-C. It doesn't just work out of the gate. And the way that you would do that is you can do it kind of application-wide, which I've chosen to do by using this attribute here, XAML compilation, and then compile. You can do this on a per class basis if you choose to. I chose it to do, again, application-wide, but there's two options that you have there, and it's pretty easy to get going. So those are sort of my performance tips and tricks. I wanted to move on to a quick couple tricks on stability. These are tips that I'm going to give you. These aren't like coming from the Forms team. These are things that I found to be really, really useful when I was building this application. So just take it with a grain of salt. These are Rob's tips. But one thing that I found out that was really, really useful was for tasks. I use a lot of tasks. I hit the internet a lot. I go hit an AMS backend. I never create my tasks and run them. When I create my tasks, I don't start them. So if we look at my Azure instance here on my my service, all my methods return a new task. They return a new task of whatever. So I'm not doing task.factory.start new. I'm not doing task.factory.run or task.run. I'm just returning a new task that's waiting to be executed. None of my tasks start off right away. When I execute and I consume and I use this task, you'll see the way that I do it is a little bit different. I will say create a task, determine an instance of the get available leagues, the one we just looked at, and then I'll call run safe. I'll say await run safe. And this run safe is a proxy method that is used to run all my tasks. And the beauty behind this is that this run safe method will first make sure that I have reachability. Can my user connect to the internet? Do they have connection first? Almost all my tasks that are coming from Azure are going to be needing a connection. In addition to that, it will run it in the context of a try-catch clause. So I'll make none of the tasks that will run through this run safe method will ever throw an exception that will be unhandled. All exceptions will be handled, and they'll be notified and handled in a central exception handling area where I can log into insights, I can notify the user, whatever I need to do. Finally, it will also allow me to cancel out of these tasks. Every view model, my base view model, has a cancellation token that's associated with it, and every task that gets executed within a view model uses that cancellation token. And so this run safe method will also facilitate the cancellation process of those long-running tasks. And so the beauty behind that is again, I don't have to wrap all of my tasks, there could be hundreds of tasks throughout the application, in a try-catch clause. I run through this one proxy method, and it will make sure that everything happens properly. And then all I have to do is make sure that it didn't fault out, and I can get the value and say, return task.results or whatever I need to do. It's just like executing a task that kicks off right away. You just have more control over it. And then one of the things that I also kind of like to do is use a busy control, or a busy class, I should say. Again, this is something that I found to be useful as a pattern for applications that I'm working on. But if you've ever used the isBusy flag in your view models, which I do, my base view model has isBusy flag, which is a bool. It's set to, I think it's right here. Yeah, isBusy. So this isBusy property, I'll use when I'm going to display or hide certain elements. So animation, activity indicators or progress bars, I'll show and hide based on the value of isBusy. And that's not uncommon, right? A lot of developers use isBusy to turn on and show different things. The problem is that you could forget to set isBusy to false sometimes. So set to true, and maybe something errors out or throws an exception, and you'll forget to set it to false. So one of the things that I do is I run my tasks within the context of a busy class. This busy class just is a very simple class. It derives from iDisposable, and it just turns the flag to false during dispose right here. And the cool thing about that is all I have to do is put this in a using statement, and then anything within inside of this will automatically sort of turn the flag on and turn the flag off as I exit that context of that using statement. So another quick little cheesy kind of tip that has served me well in the past. So I wanted to mention that. A couple more quick tips. I know we're running short on time here. If you create your UI in C#, a lot of developers do. Don't add your root container. Let's say you're adding 7 layers deep. I have a stack layout, then I'm adding something to that, then I'm adding some things inside of that, da, 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 da. Don't add that root stack layout to the visual tree until you're done populating all of its children. Every time you add a child to an element that's already part of the visual tree, you're creating unnecessary layout passes and measurements and all this kind of stuff that has to happen every single time. So create your stack layout, add everything to the stack layout, add everything to the children in the stack layout, all its ancestors, all that kind of stuff down the road. And then at the very end, add your stack layout to the page, okay? The very end. That'll save you some headaches. Another quick little trick is create a single static reusable instance of converters. All my converters have a static instance, so I'm going to come here and choose a quick converter real quickly. They're all in one file right here. So I've got a null int value converter right here. I always create a static instance of this, and I use this static instance instead of creating new instances of this converter. So right here, I'm going to use the converter, and I say x static local null int value converter.instance. Okay. The nicest thing about this is I don't have to create a resource key, and I don't have to create a new instance of this converter every time I'm going to use it. This cuts down on the amount of objects you create, and it cuts down on the amount of RAM you have to use. And converters are perfect for static instances. So that's a cool little trick to help minimize the amount of code you write. And then finally, just some kind of tips that have served me well is make sure you always unsubscribe from Messaging Center whenever you're moving away from a page. If you don't unsubscribe, it'll keep the instance around. Same thing with events. Always make sure you unwire all your events. I do my eventing on appearing and on disappearing. That is just the safest way for me to wire and unwire my events. Keep in mind, on appearing and on disappearing gets called at different times for iOS and Android, but in this case, it works really, really well for events. And then finally, you want to make sure your pages are getting destructed. Add some debug logging to your destructors on all your pages and control to make sure they're getting cleaned up. You will see bad performance if you're not recycling, you're not seeing those instances get freed up. So add some debug code to your constructors. Just make sure that those things are getting cleaned up after a few instances are created. Otherwise, you're going to be in bad shape, and you've probably got something hanging on to some sort of hook in there. We're going to talk about absolute layout. I think that's it. I just want to mention Evolve. If you're going to be in the Atlanta area this April, we'd love to see you guys at Evolve. It's an amazing conference I've done the last couple of years, so I encourage everybody to join. Rob, I'll turn it back over to you. I know we're almost out of time, but if there's any additional questions you want to field, I'm happy to answer them.
Great. Yeah, there are some questions in here. So John says, if you have a lot of rows in the list and each row has a large number of views required to display it, which strategy would normally be best? I think this is getting back to the stack layout versus the absolute layout versus the, or no, I'm sorry, this is the retain versus recycle.
Yeah, I would imagine recycle element's going to be your best bet in that case. It would not so much come down to the amount of views you have, it comes down to the amount of bindings you have. So if you've got 25, 30 bindings, then you would want to go with retain. But if you have a lot of views, but there's maybe 10 bindings in there, I would say recycle element's going to be your best bet. What I've also done is I put some logging code into my code behind when the page loads and when it finishes loading, and I might do some quick testing to see what the better one is. We always recommend that we're going to give your best case recommendation, but really you should do some metrics and make sure that that is actually true. So a great way to do that is to make that 300 rows, 3,000 rows, and it'll magnify the difference even more. So see which route works best for you. But I would say probably recycle element.
Awesome. And for those who didn't see, I put in the chat window our new class, Xam312, which is talking about Xamarin.Forms list views, covers the various strategies you can use along with some other performance enhancements. So if you want to get some hands-on experience doing that, go ahead and register for that class. It goes into a lot of what Rob's been talking about here. Another question, what's the best way to create a content page that you need to create after the page appears? There's no way to bind the elements. It needs to be created after the data is returned from a service call.
Can you repeat the first part of that again, sorry?
Absolutely. What's the best way to create a content page that you need to create after the page appears? There's no way to bind the elements. It needs to be created after the data is returned from a service call.
So you created a page, and then you're getting data from a service, and then you're going to bind that data to your page content.
So this is Andrew. If you can maybe expand on that a little bit, we might want to come back to that one just to make sure that Rob understands what you're talking about. I'll leave that there for just a second.
And always feel free to, if I'm not able to answer your question here, please reach out to me. My email address is rob.derosa@xamarin.com. I'm happy to take these offline as well if need be.
Okay. Another one. If each row in a list view includes image views and the same images are used across multiple rows, is there any optimization possible to reuse an image rather than having multiple instances of the same image? So if you're using maybe a thumb up image on each row of a list, is there any way to avoid instantiating multiple images of the same symbol?
Not sure you can do that in Xaml. You could possibly do that in code behind, I would think. That's a good question. Forms might even do some stuff for you to recognize that image has already been loaded, but I'm not sure. I'd actually have to ping the Forms team on that one. It's a good question.
Yeah, I think the image cell or the image does do some caching, if I'm not mistaken. But one thing I was thinking of, you could just make it a static resource and just keep pointing to just one static instance.
Exactly. That's in your app.xaml file, you can create static resources, or directly in that page if it's specific to just that page in your XAML, create a static resource. That's a good idea.
Okay, another one. What's the fastest way of checking is network reachable reliably? You know.
So yeah, what I did is I just used this plugin. I created this. Let's see here, my base view model. So I created this property that just gets set by the cross connectivity. So this is a plugin that James Montemagno wrote. That's pretty great. It'll check the is connected. I check this. So I set this initially when my application first starts, and then there's an event that you can subscribe to whenever the networking changes for that specific platform. So it's not like I'm going to ping it, I'm going to pull it every 500 milliseconds or every 2 seconds. I set it initially, and then I wait for it to tell me when it's changed. And then I just store that value. But this is a great plugin.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Question, can you show more on the place items, the circle shape with a number in it?
Yeah, actually, that's one of the, that's one of the sort of hacky things that I do here. It kind of depends on where you lie on that fence, but the circles are just buttons. And the reason I'm using buttons is because, I'm trying to find one here. It's a page I know has one. League details. So these buttons that have those circles are really, they're just buttons. Button is one of the only controls in Forms that allows you to specify border radius. And so what we do there is we just create a button and we'll make it, let's say it's 36 by 36. I'll make the corner radius 18, or the border radius 18. And then I'll just place text on top of that and center it instead of an absolute layout. And that's how you get that UI with the circles. So no custom drawing, no images being used here at all. I mean, you can click on it, but nothing happens because there's no event handler wired up to it. These are buttons as well. Just because, again, it's one of the only elements that I can use that has border radius. These actually are clickable, so it makes more sense. But feel free to use different elements within forms to your benefit if it provides you functionality that other ones don't. Some may argue that it's a button's it's not the right control for it. So you could create a custom render that renders a circle if you want to. I chose to keep more code in the shared code and less custom renders. Totally up to you.
All right, so going back to that question about optimizing the images that you have in the same one, we got a lot of people suggesting just use a lazy of type T. So create it the very first time, and then just return it after every. So good ideas there.
That'd be right. That'd be more in your code line or your view model if you can wire that up. So it's not just like a string to a source. You actually have to do a little bit more there. But that's a tried and true method using lazy. So certainly you could use that.
All right. Are there any potential gotchas when using an event to command behavior?
I mean, if you're going to use event handlers, you have to make sure that you're unwiring the event. I don't think that you have that same limitation with commands. I use event handlers in mine just because I like to handle my actions and my interactions with user elements inside the page itself and not in the view model. But that's more of just sort of, it's more of a personal type decision. A lot of developers will use commands instead. I don't think there's a significant benefit to using one versus the other. It's more, in my opinion, it's more about where do you want to handle interactions? Are you more comfortable doing it in the view model? Do you want to keep that holistically inside the page itself? And you can use commands either way. I can still use a command that is in my page too. I think for me, it comes down to just personal choice.
All right. In your experience, have you come across any scenario where you can't use data binding? Something like a dynamic page control or something like that.
I have to think about that. It's pretty rare. I'd say through string formatting and converters, I'm able to bind almost anything. I think the only time that I haven't is when I have like three things that I need to use to three values that I need to consider in order to display one thing. In WPF, I could use a multi-binding for that. In Forms, I don't think we have multi-bindings yet. So that might be an area where you have to consider more than one or two values to display something or render something. So I think I've run into that once or twice. And a lot of times you can get around that by creating another property in your view model. I'll almost always do that. I'll create another property that consolidates these other properties and gives me the value that I want, and then I'll bind to that. So typically, with a little bit of manipulation within your view model, you can make it so that you can bind to those values.
All right. And what's the best way to implement notification support in Forms?
With regards to like iNotify property changed, that thing, or
I think like the local and remote notifications. I think that's what.
Oh, push notifications.
Yeah.
Got it. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of code share that can happen between the two. But what you'll see here is that I have a push notification interface called iPush notifications. And this uses dependency service. This is really for registering for push notifications and then checking to see whether or not the user is registered. So that's part of the push notification process. The other part is receiving push notifications and displaying data based on the payload coming in. That is the part that can't really be shared. The reason being is because for iOS, all that push notification stuff happens inside of your app delegate as part of that class, and it's not something that you can really farm out to other classes to do. They have to be inside of this class, and that's kind of why I wasn't able to share more code or put this into an interface. For Android, it's kind of the same thing. You've got this push notification class here that doesn't really follow much of what iOS does. Android has its like a background service that facilitates push notifications and things like that. So they're like opposite. And unfortunately, there's not a ton of things you can do to share that code. Once I got my payload and I'm actually going to send data to the application that says do this, I use Messaging Center to facilitate that. So you'll see Messaging Center send, and I'm passing a payload here. You'll see the same thing here and on the iOS side. But that's once I've got my payload. I've actually got an object that I deserialized from my JSON that came into my push notification. Curating that data and getting it can't be shared, but once you've got it, then you can handle it centrally. I guess that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, same basic idea you have to do with backgrounding. Some things are just platform specific, and you just have to do it there.
Some things are just, yeah. You know, I spent quite a while looking for something that was Forms compatible that would allow me to share more code, and I wasn't finding a whole lot out there, and I think I know why. It's just they're apples and oranges, really.
Right. Going back to the checking if the network's available, you had your answer. Would you do something similar to the is network reachable with geolocation?
Yeah, I guess you could. It's been a while since I've done geolocation or geofencing, and so I don't really remember the different events or methods that you have for the iOS and Android side of things. But potentially, if you were, let's say you're wanting to, be notified when they enter or exit a geofence, I'm sure that you could create an interface or class or plugin similar to what James created for that. There might already be one out there. I don't know. This application doesn't take advantage of geofencing or geolocation just yet, so I don't know. But certainly, it seems like it'd be certainly possible.
Okay, and let's see. Can you explain the performance issue while switching between the leaderboard list and its detail view?
Yeah, that should have gone away. When I recorded the video, so if I'm here on this guy right now and I go into one, it should be pretty quick. There's no lag. The video shows a little bit of a lag because that was recorded back in like July, and I made some performance improvements since then. But it should be pretty quick now. So I think those are just optimizations that I made since the video was recorded.
Oh, okay. Are you dealing with huge sets of data coming from Azure? About how big is the data?
I'm not dealing with data's not too big. I think the biggest thing would be pulling down all the when the user initially logs in, would pull down all the leagues that user is a part of. So if the user is a part of like 20 leagues, it's going to pull down all the leagues. It's going to pull down all the players of each league, and it's going to pull down your history of that league, your game history. So that'd probably be the biggest initial pull. The rest of the calls, I try to modularize out so there's not a ton of data coming down. It's very much like a lazy load type thing. We don't pull data until you actually navigate into a certain section.
Okay. And the messaging center is great, but it is blocking calls. Do we know if we have plans for async messaging?
I don't know off the top of my head. I haven't seen any performance hit when I do notification stuff. So I never really asked. That's a good question. I can take a note of that and see if I can ask Jason.
Yeah, and first, just sending a message should be instantaneous. There should be no blocking on sending or receiving the message, but I haven't tried. Maybe you could just run it in a task run or something like that as well.
It could be what possibly is happening is it's not returning until the recipient of that message processes his action. So he's going to get a notification that something happened, and then he's going to do something on that. You want to make sure that when you're doing something that you're awaiting that action. So while Messaging Center may not execute your action and move on out of the box, you might need to do that. You might need to make sure that when you're executing some logic based on a message that gets hit, make sure you're doing that on a separate thread, or make sure that's a different task. And that might help speed things up.
All right, and let's see. When using proportional sizing for views, are fonts used for text in those views also sized proportionally? I guess they must be to ensure text fits when the container is resized.
Well, it'll be if it's scaled, but I don't believe that it will change the size. It's not zoom, right? So this is not vector. It's not going. When I change the size of something, I'm changing the width and height of like maybe a box view or a stack layout. I'm not changing, or even the label. I'm changing the width and height of a label. I'm not changing the size of the content within that label. So the font won't scale up unless you're executing a scale like you call scale to. That will magnify it. But if you're just using size proportional, that will just make the coordinates or the bounds of that label bigger. It won't make the font and size of it bigger. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and how about, are there any interesting plugins or NuGet plugins or anything else, NuGet packages that we might not know about that you like to use?
Let's see here. So the ones that I use are connectivity. I use Image Circle. The Image Circle one's great. If you're trying to display an image like a profile image, I use Image Circle a lot. It puts that nice little, it kind of crops the image to be a circle. I use that one. I use, there's a settings one as well that I believe James Xamarin.Mac wrote as well. So if you typically store settings like an iOS NS user default, so small key value pairs of content, there's a great plugin that does that cross-platform to kind of make things a little bit easier. So that's a good one. There's becoming quite a few of them in NuGet. When I search now, I get tons and tons of plugins by different authors. But those are the ones I know off the top of my head. I haven't really explored recently.
Pretty much anything James makes is probably going to be good.
Yeah, it's a solid bet. It's going to be good. But even beyond what he's been making, there's a lot of new contributors out there. So I'd encourage you guys to just go check out the NuGet repos occasionally and see what's available. I think we're also starting to log them on our components.Xamarin.com website. There's a plugin section now, and we're trying to catalog these even if they're done by third-party developers. So I checked there. There might be some gold there.
Yeah, there's, so let me put that link in the chat window. There's lots of plugins there as well. Going back to the performance, Michael says, this is using the latest code running on the device, not based on the video, for the performance issue between switching between the leaderboard list and the detailed view.
I'm not seeing that performance hit, but if maybe they can provide some additional details on the hardware they're using or the operating system they're using, I don't see that performance hit, but certainly doesn't mean it's not there.
All right, and let's see. Another question, I don't know if you're going to know this, but are there any plans to bring a carousel view to Xamarin.Forms? I think that's probably a question better for the Xamarin.Forms team for their roadmap.
Yeah.
But
I think he's asking page versus a view. I think I would like to see a view there. I think forcing you to use page is a tough decision to make, but I don't know off the top of my head now.
And there are a bunch of blog posts on how to do it out there. It's just not built in at the moment. Let's see. Any tips for using Xamarin.Forms on the tablet? So iPad, Droid, or Surface versus the phone screen formats?
No, it should be pretty similar. This Sport app actually works on tablets for Android and iOS. The UI just kind of stretches proportionally, but I would use Absolute Layout. Absolute Layout's going to be your best friend because it handles the different screen sizes so well, especially if you're going to be doing position or sizing proportionally. That's what I recommend. But Forms is actually really good at sort of adjusting to the available space that you have. You just have to make sure that it looks appropriate, so things aren't too small versus too big.
Okay. I don't know. Again, I don't know if you're gonna know this. Can't really find any good geofencing plugin. Any plans for a geofencing plugin? Not that I know of.
Not that nothing off the top of my head. I haven't heard of any of my colleagues building one, but keep my eyes open.
There is a lightning lecture on our site for geofencing in Android. It's not cross-platform, doesn't have a plugin, so it's not really what you're asking. But if anybody hasn't seen that, we do have a lightning lecture there talking about geofencing also. And let's see, will a recorded video be posted to the webinar? Absolutely, we are recording it. We'll try to get it up as soon as possible. No promises on how long that will take, but keep an eye out. We'll try to get that up along with a link to the PDF of the slides as well. How does proportional sizing work with word wrap of labels? So a label in a stack layout. When the width reduces the height will need to increase.
I couldn't tell you. I would imagine it would get clipped if there's not enough room to wrap that text next line. I'd imagine that it would start to clip the text. But it's not going to, the font's not going to shrink in size. It's not going to auto adjust like iOS can do with labels. So as the width and height shrink and the size becomes smaller, I would imagine that it would just start to clip text or maybe ellipsis the text, depending on the settings that you have. I'd have to actually code it up to see what it does, but that'd be my guess. Hello?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Chris, Chris mentioned I use Visual Studio for Xamarin.Forms development and recently got the new Google